St. Teresa saw it, not as a metaphor, not as poetry, as a raw, documented truth that she put into writing in the 16th century and that still lands like a fist to the chest today. She looked at the human soul, and she looked at marriage, and she said, two people can sleep in the same bed every single night for 40 years and still be total strangers. And then she said something even harder. She said most souls do the exact same thing to God. That is what this script is about. Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada was born on the 28th of March, 1515, in Avila, Spain. Not the pleasant, warm city you might picture. Avila, in the early 1500s, was a walled fortress town on the high Castilian plateau, sitting at an elevation of 3,700 feet, swept by winds off the Sierra de Gredos, protected by 88 granite towers. It was a city built around walls within walls, and Teresa would spend her life writing about the walls people build inside themselves. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a serious man who banned novels of chivalry from the house, read philosophy, and raised 12 children after 2 marriages. Teresa was the child of his second wife, Beatriz de Ahumada, who died when Teresa was 13. That number matters, 13, because that is the year everything shifted. Her mother was gone, and Teresa, beautiful and sociable and sharp, turned toward the world. She started reading the romance novels her father had banned. She made friends with cousins whose idea of fun her father thought was dangerous, and she began to understand something she would write about 50 years later, that distraction is the first wall a soul builds between itself and God. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the bed. Teresa understood marriage from the inside, not from her own married life. She never married. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1536 at 21 years old. After spending a year in an Augustinian school for noble girls, she understood marriage because she grew up surrounded by it. She watched her mother's exhaustion. She watched her father's grief after her mother died. She watched the women of Avila living in households where proximity was not intimacy, where sharing a roof was not the same as sharing a life, where two people occupied the same physical space and remained, in every meaningful way, unknown to each other. And Teresa had a name for that condition. In the interior castle, the masterpiece she wrote in 1577 in the last decade of her life, she described it as living in the outer rooms of a castle. You are inside, you have not left, but you have not gone anywhere near the center, and the center is where everything actually lives. Here's the image she used, and it is worth sitting with. She asked her readers to imagine the soul as a castle made of a single diamond or a very clear crystal. Inside that castle there are 7 sets of rooms. She called them mansions or dwelling places. And in the innermost center of the castle, in the 7th and deepest mansion, lives God himself, the king, radiating light outward through every room. The closer you get to the center, the more light there is. The further away you stay, the more you are living in darkness. And outside the castle walls entirely, she wrote this clearly, everything is foul and dark and infested with toads and vipers and venomous creatures. Now hear what she said next. Most people, she wrote, never make it past the 1st or 2nd mansion. They enter the castle. They are inside. But they stay near the entrance, distracted by the noise of the outside world, by their attachments, by their fear, by their comfort. They are technically inside the same house as God, but they have never once knocked on the door of the room where he waits. 2 strangers in the same house every night. If you value documented spiritual history and deep Catholic mystical teaching like this, subscribe right now. It is the only way you will not miss what comes next in this story, and it is the best way to support our work. Also drop a comment right now and tell us what city you are watching from. We want to know where this is reaching. Now, this script is built on primary source research. Everything you are hearing comes from Teresa's own documented writings, primarily The Interior Castle, translated and edited by E. Allison Piers, and the collected works of St. Teresa of Avila, Volume 1, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez of the Institute of Carmelite Studies, which is the gold standard academic edition used by theologians and historians worldwide. These are not popular summaries. These are the actual manuscripts. Now back to what Teresa saw. She had not always been the woman who understood this so clearly. In her autobiography, which she finished around 1562 and called the Book of Her Life, she spent pages documenting her own spiritual mediocrity. She used a specific word for it. She called it aridity, dryness, the feeling of going through the motions of prayer and feeling nothing, connecting with nothing, speaking into what felt like empty air. And she connected that aridity directly to the same pattern she would later write about in The Interior Castle. She had been going to prayer. She had been saying the words, but she had not been going in. She had been standing at the door of the castle, or just barely inside the first courtyard, and calling that enough. Enough to satisfy her conscience. Not enough to actually change anything. Not enough to meet anyone. She wrote in Chapter 8 of The Life that mental prayer is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. Not a ritual, not a performance, a friendship. And the cruelest thing about a friendship that only one person is showing up for? The other person is always there. They have not moved. They are in the center of the castle, waiting, sending light through every room. And you are at the entrance, checking the locks, talking about the weather. Teresa spent nearly 18 years in that state. 18 years at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, where the rule of the old Carmelite order was lax enough that nuns received visitors in the parlor for hours, entertained guests, maintained worldly friendships. She was popular. She was charming. She also knew something was very wrong, because she could feel the gap. She could feel the distance between where she was and where she was supposed to be. And the gap felt exactly like what she would later describe in Other Souls. The strange, painful loneliness of being in the same house as someone and having no real contact with them at all. Then 1554 happened. She was 39 years old. She walked into the convent oratory and saw a statue of the wounded Christ, an image of the suffering Lord, and something broke open in her. She wrote that the sight of the wounds made her grief so intense she could not bear it, and she threw herself down before that image, begging him not to rise until he had given her what she asked, which was simply this, that he would make her whole. That was the conversion. Not the dramatic kind that strikes in an instant and leaves no scars. The long kind, the kind that costs everything. And what it cost Teresa, specifically, was her attachment to the outer rooms of the castle. She had to start going in. By 1560, she had received her first mystical visions. They were documented by her confessors, including Father Garcia de Toledo, a Dominican scholar, and later by Domingo Bañez, one of the most rigorous theological minds in 16th century Spain, a man not given to credulity or sentiment. They confirmed what she described. They recorded it. And what she described was not romantic ecstasy. It was contact. It was the feeling of meeting something real, of encountering a presence in the interior rooms of the soul that had always been there, that had always been waiting, and that she had been ignoring for nearly 2 decades. She also saw what that contact looked like from the outside. And this is where the marriage comparison sharpens into something that cuts. In the interior castle, chapter 2 of the 7th mansion, she made a comparison between spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage that is one of the clearest and most devastating things ever written about what intimacy actually means. She said that between a soul and spiritual betrothal with God and a soul and full spiritual marriage with God, the difference is exactly like the difference between people who are engaged and people who are actually married. You can be engaged, you can be promised, you can have the ring, you can sleep in the same house, but something remains separated. There is still, she wrote, a union and a possible separation. The wax of 2 candles can touch, and the flame can merge. She used that image. But you can still pull the wicks apart afterward. Each remains a distinct thing. But spiritual marriage, the real thing, the 7th mansion thing, is not like that. She wrote that it is like rain falling from heaven into a river. You cannot, after that, divide the river water from the rain. You cannot separate the stream that has flowed into the ocean from the ocean itself. There is no going back to being 2 things. There is only the one thing. And the tragedy she described, the quiet, devastating tragedy she saw in so many souls and had lived herself for 18 years, is that most people go through their entire lives in the outer courtyard. They are inside the castle. They believe in God. They say the prayers. They go to Mass. They sleep in the same house as the king who is waiting for them in the innermost room. And they never once walk past the 2nd mansion. They remain, in every practical sense, strangers. This is what she saw in human marriage too. Not as a condemnation, as a mirror. 2 people enter the same house. 2 people share a bed. But one person has built walls inside themselves. Walls of pride, of fear, of distraction, of what she called attachment to created things. And they will not let the other person pass those walls. So the proximity continues. The physical togetherness continues. And the inner strangers remain inner strangers. She was not anti-marriage. She described Christ as the soul's true spouse. She used the language of matrimony constantly, deliberately, because she believed the union she was describing was more real, more permanent, more intimate than anything 2 human bodies in a room can achieve. But she used marriage as the comparison precisely because she understood what it felt like when it failed, when it was hollow at the center, when 2 people had said every word and signed every document and shared every meal and still had never, not once, actually met. Now let us talk about what happened on November 18th, 1572. That was the day Teresa received what she called the spiritual marriage. It happened during Holy Communion at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila. She was 57 years old. She had been living her Reformed Carmelite life for a decade, having founded the first discalced Carmelite convent, St. Joseph's in Avila, in 1562. Her spiritual life had been advancing for years through all the mansion levels she would later describe in the interior castle. And on that November morning, she recorded in her spiritual testimonies, number 31, that Christ appeared to her and extended his right hand, and she could see the nail wound in it, and he spoke. He said, "See this nail. It is the sign of our union. From this day on, you are my bride." He then said, "Up to now you had not earned it, but now you will not only see me as your creator, your king, your God, but from now on you will care for my honor as my true bride. My honor is yours, your glory is mine." She was given these words. She wrote them down, and then she wrote about what happened after. She said the first result of this union was a complete forgetfulness of self, that it truly seemed as if this soul had lost its own being. The word she used, lost, not destroyed, not erased. Lost, the way rain is lost when it falls into the river. You cannot find the rain anymore, not because it is gone, but because it has become something larger. The second result, she wrote, was an inner desire for suffering that no longer disturbed her. She desired what God desired. If he wanted her to suffer, she was glad. If he did not, she accepted that too. The distinction between her will and his will had become, in a functional sense, dissolved. Now stop and feel what that means. Because here is the thing most people miss when they read Teresa. They read about the spiritual marriage and they think, that is for mystics, that is for nuns, that is for people who live in convents and spend 6 hours a day in prayer. Not for me. And Teresa anticipated that exact objection. In the interior castle, when she was writing for her Carmelite sisters in the last years of her life, she finished the book on November 29th, 1577, exactly 5 years to the week after her own spiritual marriage. She wrote plainly that she was not describing something available only to a handful of exceptional souls. She wrote that she believed deeply that God desires every soul to reach the center, every soul, not as an elite achievement, as the purpose of the castle's existence. The castle was built for the king to dwell in. The king does dwell in it, in the center of your soul, right now, whether you have ever gone there or not. The question she was asking, the question she spent her entire life asking, is whether you have bothered to walk through the rooms toward him. And this is where the marriage image cuts deepest. Because you can be married to someone and never know them. You can live in the same house for 50 years and remain strangers. And most of the people who do that do not feel dramatic loneliness. They feel a vague, settled dissatisfaction. A mild ache they cannot name. A sense that something was supposed to happen that never quite did. They stopped after the first courtyard. They told themselves that was normal, that this was what it felt like for everyone, that this quiet distance was the human condition. Teresa said, no, the human condition is not this. The human condition, rightly understood, is the castle. And the castle has a center. And the center is reachable. She knew this because she reached it. And she knew the cost of it, too. And she wrote both things down so nobody could say she'd made it sound easy. The sixth mansion, the level before the spiritual marriage, she described as one of the most terrible experiences a soul can have. She wrote that the depression which can afflict the soul in the sixth mansion is comparable only to the tortures of hell. The soul is torn between intense closeness to God and intense suffering, between extraordinary divine favors and extraordinary interior afflictions. Imagine getting close enough to the center of the castle that you can feel the warmth of the light coming from within, but the door has not opened yet, and you are standing in a corridor in the dark, and you have been standing there for months, and you do not know if it will ever open. That is what Teresa described in the sixth mansion. She did not hide this. She could have written only about the beautiful parts. She wrote everything. She wrote about the years of aridity. She wrote about the 18 years in the outer courtyard. She wrote about the corridor of the sixth mansion, where the soul can feel like it is losing its mind. She wrote all of it because she understood that anyone who only tells you the good parts of a journey is not actually trying to help you make it. She also wrote something devastating about what happens to the soul that turns back, that looks at the sixth corridor and decides it is not worth it, that says, I will go back to the first courtyard. It is warmer there, quieter, less demanding. She wrote in the second mansion of the interior castle that the devil works especially hard on souls who have already begun to go deeper, because a soul in the outer courtyard costs him nothing. It is already going nowhere. But a soul that has moved to the second or third mansion, that soul is a threat. So the enemy fills the corridor with noise, with the voices of old friends urging you to come back to the world, with reasonable sounding arguments for why you should stop, with the memory of how comfortable the outer rooms were, with the suggestion that this discomfort means you are on the wrong path rather than the right one. Sound familiar? It does not require mysticism to recognize that pattern. Anyone who has ever tried to go deeper into a relationship, any relationship, knows what that pullback toward the surface feels like. The moment where honesty becomes dangerous, where vulnerability requires more courage than you have built up, yet where it would be so much easier to just go back to talking about ordinary things. Teresa called that choice the first disaster of the spiritual life. To have been awakened and then to go back to sleep. She wrote that the soul which does this falls into a worse state than before, because now it knows what it has abandoned. Two strangers in the same bed who once almost woke up and chose not to. Let us talk now about what she taught about prayer, because people think prayer is separate from all of this. Prayer, for Teresa, was not a separate activity from the interior life. Prayer was the interior life. It was the act of walking through the rooms. It was what you called it when you moved from the outer courtyard toward the center. She defined mental prayer in those now famous words: an intimate sharing between friends, not words spoken into silence, not duty performed. Friendship. The kind where you show up. The kind where you say the real things. The kind where you stop performing and start being present. And she noticed something that every honest person of prayer has noticed. You can pray for years and never actually pray. You can say the words, you can keep the schedule, you can observe all the exterior forms, and still be standing in the entrance hall, face pressed against the door, hearing movement inside and choosing not to knock. She wrote about this specifically in The Way of Perfection, the practical guide she wrote for her nuns at St. Joseph's in Avila, between 1562 and 1566, 4 years before the interior castle. She was writing for beginners in prayer. She told them to begin simply: take time to be alone with God. She did not say, make yourself feel something. She did not say, achieve a state of spiritual ecstasy. She said, be alone with him, be present. Bring the whole self, not the tidy version, not the version that says the right words, the actual self. Bring what is real. That instruction sounds obvious. It is the hardest thing in the world, because what most people bring to prayer is the version of themselves they think God wants to see, the cleaned up version, the version without the resentment or the fear or the shame or the confusion. They put on the good face and go into the parlor, and they have a polite conversation, and they leave feeling nothing because they brought nothing real to the encounter. Teresa did not do that. That is why it took her 18 years to get past the outer rooms, and also why, once she did, the whole castle opened up. Because she started bringing the actual self, the messy, attached, complicated self that had been hiding in the entrance hall, and calling it virtue. She also wrote something in The Way of Perfection that deserves to stand alone in a room and be looked at from every angle. She wrote, for mental prayer, it is not necessary to be alone. What is necessary is that God be with you, and you with God. And the way you make that happen is not by going somewhere, it is by going inward. That is the whole architecture of the interior castle. God is not outside. God is not in a church building, though he can be encountered there. God is in the innermost center of your own soul. The journey is not outward. It is not even upward in the sense people usually mean. It is inward, through the rooms, past the noise of the outer courtyard, past the early mansions where virtue is still costing effort, past the fourth mansion where the supernatural element first enters and the soul begins to receive rather than only to give, past the fifth, where the first taste of real union occurs, like the two candle flames touching, into the sixth, with its corridor of darkness and suffering, and then, if the soul does not turn back, into the seventh, where the king has been waiting, not with accusation, not with a list of all the rooms you did not enter sooner, with the image Teresa recorded in her spiritual testimonies, a nail-pierced hand extended, a voice saying, my honor is yours, your glory is mine, two things that have become, at last, one thing. Teresa of Avila died on the 4th of October, 1582, at the Carmelite convent of Alba de Tormes in the province of Salamanca, Spain. She was 67 years old. She had founded 17 convents of the Reformed Carmelite rule. She had written more than 450 letters that survive, plus the Life, the Way of Perfection, the Interior Castle, the Book of Foundations, and the Spiritual Testimonies. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her the first female doctor of the Church, and there is a detail in the manuscripts of the Interior Castle that almost no one talks about. When she finished writing the book on the 29th of November 1577 in Toledo, she had written it in secret sessions, mostly at night after her other obligations were done. She had written it on orders from her confessor because the original manuscript of her life was locked in the Inquisition's files and unavailable to her readers. So the Interior Castle was written entirely from memory and from the continued experience of her own interior life. She was not copying from earlier notes. She was writing from inside the experience itself. And when Father Geronimo Gracian, her Carmelite superior, asked her in November 1581, the year before her death, whether she had reached the state she described in the seventh mansion, she answered by letter. She wrote, she has received such an assurance of coming one day to the fruition of God that she almost imagines she has already come into possession of him. And then she said, she only desires to continue in his service, even at the cost of terrible sufferings. She would not mind serving him to the end of the world, not with the satisfied stillness of someone who has arrived and can rest, with the active, burning attention of someone who has finally stopped being a stranger. There is an extraordinary document buried in the archives of the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila, where Teresa lived for 27 years before her reform. The convent kept records of the parlor visits, the hours Teresa and the other nuns spent receiving worldly guests and maintaining the kind of social connections the old, relaxed Carmelite rule permitted. The records show that Teresa was one of the most frequently visited nuns at the Incarnation. She was popular, socially connected, entertaining. People came to talk to her. And in her life, written years later, she described those parlor hours as the period of her deepest spiritual damage. Not because anything wicked happened there, but because those hours in the outer room, talking and laughing and being charming and useful to the people in her social world, were hours she was not walking toward the center. They were comfortable. They were pleasant. They felt productive and good. And they were keeping her in the entrance hall of the castle. The soul that sleeps in the outer rooms does not usually know it is sleeping. That is the whole point. It feels awake. It feels engaged. It feels like this is what life is. The warmth of the parlor, the familiar faces, the talk, the noise. It is only when you have been, even once, in a deeper room that you begin to feel the difference. That you begin to notice that the parlor was always a little too loud, a little too busy, a little too much about everything except the one thing. And that is what Teresa of Avila saw in two strangers sleeping in the same bed every night. Not a failure of love, not a failure of goodwill, a failure to go inward, a failure to risk the corridor, a choice to remain in the comfortable outer room with someone you know by name and face and habit and still do not know at all. She saw it in human marriages. She saw it in the soul's relationship to God. She saw it in herself for 18 years before something broke open in front of a wounded statue of Christ in 1554. And she spent the rest of her life building a 7-room castle out of words so that no one else would have to spend quite that long standing at the door. Her personal copy of the manuscript she called The Book of My Life, the autobiography she had written first, the one the Inquisition confiscated, was returned to her convent after her death. When scholars examined the pages, they found her handwriting in the margins, notes she had made on her own text, small corrections, additions, things she wanted to clarify. In the section describing her 18 years of spiritual aridity, someone, probably Teresa herself, had added a single word in the margin beside the passage about the outer rooms of the soul. The word was bastaba. It meant it was enough. She had written it there not as confirmation, but as a question, as if asking herself, years later, whether she had really believed that, whether standing in the entrance hall had really ever been enough, whether two strangers in the same house had really ever been what either of them, in the deepest part of their being, actually wanted. The word sits in the margin of a 500-year-old manuscript in Avila, Spain, still waiting for an answer. Let us slow down on one more thing she wrote, because it is the piece that makes the whole structure collapse into clarity in a way that nothing else does. In the 5th mansion of the interior castle, the mansion that represents the first real experience of union, not the full marriage of the 7th, but the first real taste, Teresa used an image that she said she loved because it came not from philosophy, but from nature, the silkworm. She wrote that the soul in the early stages of prayer is like a silkworm. It hatches from what appears to be a dead, cold seed. The soul dead to the world beginning to wake. It feeds, it grows, it builds, and then it spins itself a cocoon of its own making, a cocoon of prayer and virtue and detachment, and inside that cocoon, it dies to what it was. And from that death, something entirely different emerges. Not the worm, not anything that walked in, something new, something with wings. She wrote this and then said, "What more do you want? This is the story of every soul. The worm enters the silk of prayer and leaves everything behind. And what comes out on the other side is not the same creature that went in. But the silkworm cannot go through that process if it never spins the cocoon, if it stays outside, feeding on mulberry leaves, comfortable, growing fatter and never building the structure that would transform it, never giving up the outer room for the inner one, never accepting the disorientation of the dark, airless interior of the thing it has made for itself. Comfortable, warm, exactly what it was before, and exactly what it will always be. This is where she gets most severe and most honest and most useful. Because she understood something that very few spiritual writers have the courage to say plainly: comfort is not neutral. Staying in the outer rooms is not a holding position. It is a choice made every day against movement toward the center. The soul does not drift toward the 7th mansion. It does not accidentally end up in spiritual marriage. It walks there deliberately through rooms that get progressively more demanding at the cost of progressively more of itself. And the vast majority of people, she was not naive about this, she had been in a convent for decades, the vast majority of people will not make that walk. Not because they are wicked, not because they do not believe, but because the parlor is familiar and the corridor is dark and nobody told them what was waiting at the end. The enemy is good at suggesting that what they already have is enough. Bastaba. It was enough, was it? If you have been listening to this for any length of time, you understand now why the title carries the weight it does. Two strangers sleeping in the same bed every night. That is not a judgment on a specific marriage. That is Teresa of Avila's diagnosis of the human condition in the absence of interiority, the condition in which proximity masquerades as union And familiarity masquerades as knowledge, and the daily habit of being near someone masquerades as actually being with them. She saw it in the convent parlors of 16th century Avila. She saw it in her own soul for 18 years. She saw it in the marriages of the women who came to her for counsel. And she wrote a 7-mansion map of the way out. Not because it was easy, not because she had found it easy, but because she believed, she stated this plainly and repeatedly, that the center is reachable by anyone with the will to go through the rooms. Subscribe now if you want to hear more of these documented stories from the history of Christian mysticism, and comment below with your city. We genuinely want to know where this reaches. We are back to the story. And let us end with this. Teresa of Avila finished the interior castle on November 29th, 1577. She died on the 4th of October, 1582, 4 years, and 10 months later. She had been in the 7th mansion in what she described as permanent, unbroken union with God for the last decade of her life. When Fray Diego de Yepes, one of her confessors and the man who wrote her early biography, the Vida de Santa Teresa, published in Madrid in 1615, recorded the last days of her life, he noted something that other witnesses also confirmed. In her final illness, confined to the small cell of the Carmelite convent in Alba de Tormes, she appeared to be in continuous interior conversation. Not with the people in the room, not with the nuns who cared for her, with whoever was in the center of her castle. And the expression on her face, he wrote, was the expression of someone who has finally been in the same room as the person they love, instead of sleeping next to a stranger. She had found what she was looking for in 1554, when she collapsed in front of a wounded statue and begged not to rise until she had received what she needed. It took her, from that point, 18 more years to reach the 7th mansion. Total time from birth to spiritual marriage, 57 years. Total time in the interior castle after the breakthrough of 1554, 28 years. And in those 28 years, she wrote everything, founded 17 convents, reformed an entire religious order, and left behind a library of interior cartography so precise that scholars are still mapping it in 2026. The Inquisition that had once confiscated her life eventually returned the manuscript. The pages were found to be entirely orthodox. There was nothing in them to fear. There was only a woman in Castile in the 16th century describing what it feels like to stop being a stranger in your own house. The Convent of the Incarnation in Avila still stands. You can visit it. You can walk through the room where Teresa spent her first 27 years as a nun, the parlor where she entertained so many visitors during those years of comfortable distance. The parlor is small, the walls are thick. And the cell where she finally broke through, the cell where, after 1554, she began the serious interior walk that would end in November 1572 with a nail-scarred hand and words she never forgot. That cell is preserved too. 2 rooms, 1 small building, a lifetime of distance between them. That is what she saw. That is what she mapped. And the map is still there, 7 mansions deep, for anyone willing to stop sleeping next to a stranger and finally knock on the door.